Welcome to a short review I call Paragraph Structure 101. Likely you are familiar with most of this information already, but perhaps it will introduce it to you in a way that you haven't thought about before, or that you can connect with previous ways that you've thought about how you structure and organize paragraphs in research writing. We're going to talk about introductory paragraphs and abstracts, then we're going to talk about body paragraphs, and then finally conclusions. So for our DERP, sections 1 abstract and section 2 introduction, we're really using the same kind of structure, which is shaped like an upside down triangle. I like to think of this as CPR, or context, problem, and response. You notice how an upside down triangle gets more narrow as you get to the bottom of it, and this is where your thesis lives. So let's begin at the top. The top is broader, the C, or context. Perhaps you're going to begin by narrating a teaching or learning memory. Perhaps you're going to share a writing process or teaching observation about writing. Perhaps it's something entirely different, but that connects to your research question. You want to think about your context as something that's connecting to your audience, not necessarily a hook. Certainly avoid rhetorical questions like, what do you think about writing, right? I know we're often taught that early on in education, but leaving the reader with a rhetorical question they can't answer does not garner a relationship or a connection with your audience. Experience does. So how can you begin with an experience that connects to your reader? The next one is P, problem. Instead of P, problem, I like to think about this as RQ, or research question. This is where you're going to explicitly state your research question. It doesn't have to be in the research question format, but you're going to explicitly explain, these are the things that made you, from this context framing, this is what made you think about these kinds of research questions. And then finally, the R is for response, or as I mentioned before, your thesis or main argument or main claim. This is about your investigative research and design, and it offers a potential response to the research question response. You notice I said that it's about your investigative research. You really can't, even though we write these often in introduction before we do a lot of work on a paper, I think of that as a placeholder introduction. You really can't write a well-defined introduction until you finish most parts of your paper or your project or whatever writing task that is, because you need that information in order to give kind of a full view, a holistic view of where you're going with the project. So body paragraphs, particularly argumentative body paragraphs for persuasive writing, are the opposite shape of the introduction. They're a right side up triangle. They begin with argumentative topic sentences or a subclaim. They include evidence and response to evidence. For our purposes in the DERPs, this refers to sections 3, the review of literature, and section 4, primary analysis or study design. Now, study design may not fit really well if you choose that option in this structure, because you will need to toggle a bit between giving writing that is procedural, do this step, do this step, do this step, and then giving that argument piece of, we are using these steps, or we are working through this methodology because of these reasons that are informed by my review of literature. So at the top of the triangle here, you have the argumentative topic sentence or subclaim. Remember, this doesn't have to be in the first sentence, but it should be early on in the paragraph, and it should give your paragraph some place to go. I often use the example, my dog has black and white spots. That is a fact, but it doesn't give me anywhere to go with an argument. If I say my dog's white spots keep her from getting cancer because they reflect the sun, while that's silly, that certainly gives us a place to argue, because you could say, that's not correct, or you could say, oh, well, what evidence do you have to support that? Which gets me to the next piece. When you're writing your review of literature, this will be pretty easy to kind of think about, I think, especially after you look at the tables video that we'll be talking about. So if your argumentative topic sentence is what all your sources are talking about in that paragraph or that section of your review of literature, the evidence is what the sources are saying about that topic, right? And so you will use direct quotes here or paraphrase text that's cited, and then you will respond to the evidence. Now, when you respond to evidence, I often like to, particularly if I'm stuck, use the phrase, this is significant because. So if I use a direct quote, I follow it by this is significant because, and I finish that portion of the sentence out. Now, certainly I don't want a paragraph full of this is significant because, and I go back and cross that out. And what's left usually are the really foundational pieces of my response. And so that's just a tip that helps me. Notice I have two kind of pairings of evidence and response, evidence and response. This is just to kind of illustrate that you need to have evidence and response. It's usually between 1 and 3, one very well-developed pairing or 2 or 3 that are connecting to one another, but there isn't a particular rule or strategy. I often say, and I'll say this probably again about the conclusion, it's important to go back to articles that you read in the discipline or in the genre, because that'll give you kind of a sense of those structural parameters that are often used. Finally, we don't have a fleshed out conclusion requirement for the DERP, but here are some things to think about. I just talked about know your purpose and audience. Also, leave the reader with a takeaway. What's significant about your response to the research questions? And then finally, make connections. Exemplary conclusions link back to the introduction and or the earliest sections of the work in some way. And you notice that these also take the shape of a right side up triangle. I hope this quick review was helpful to your thinking or helpful to the way you approach teaching, writing different kinds of paragraph structures, and I look forward to reading your work soon.